Hi, nice to meet you, and thanks for asking about my research. I'm basically interested in how students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, so like autism, Down syndrome, things like that, and we'll call that IDD, how to keep those students in the same schools that their family and friends go to, so rather than schools that are just for kids with disabilities. Usually the argument for children with disabilities going to separate schools is that they'll have access to special services that meet their special needs. But research has shown that they actually don't get any of those benefits in those environments. In fact, inclusion is one of the strongest predictors of employment, post-secondary education, and independent living for young adults with disabilities. So then we know that sending students to more restrictive special schools is not the solution, but we still have frustrated teachers, concerned parents, and most importantly, children who aren't getting what they need. So my research looks at how and why students with IDD get into these special schools and what can be done to support them better in their neighborhood schools. So for one study, I used data from a 2006 survey of thousands of parents around the country with disabilities to identify if there were certain groups of students with IDD who were more likely to be placed in special schools than others. So for this study, I looked at ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and whether the child lived in an urban, suburban, or a rural community. The law states that it should be the nature and severity of a child's disability that should determine how and where they're educated. For this study, I used functional skills like feeding, dressing, reading, basic words, and using money, combined with how many related services a child receives, so like speech therapy, social work. I put those two things together to create a nature and severity factor. So then the next phase of the study was to see if that nature and severity factor was affected by ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and where the child lived. So for example, if the severity of a child's disability does strongly predict placement for a child in a high-income family, but it does not seem to be a deciding factor for a child in a low-income family, then that would indicate that there may be other factors impacting the decision for the child in the low-income family. It's important for us to know what these factors are so we can keep students out of separate schools if they don't by law need to be there. So the problem is that this study can only give us clues about what helps teams decide to place students with IDD in separate schools. The next phase of the research will aim to get a deeper understanding of what else goes into that decision. So the results of this pilot study will determine which students' teams I should talk to. For example, preliminary results show that just being African American makes a student more likely to be placed in a separate school, and that nature and severity factor actually doesn't make as big of a difference for students who are African American as it does for white children. That's really important. We need to know why. We need to know what other factors influence that decision and what we can do to support those students and their teams. The students need interventions that are intensive enough to keep them successful in their home schools, and the teams need those interventions to be feasible enough that they're not daunted by the task of delivering them and feel like they need to send the student to a special school. The next step in this research is going to include interviews of team members as well as observations of students and teachers in neighborhood schools and special schools to really start to flesh out the mechanisms that keep students with IDD in their home schools. So we'll see where that goes. Thanks for